All right, Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Zeyad Farahat, a second year medical student, and we're gonna talk about lung volumes and lung mechanics 1 and 2. So, first of all, what are lung volumes? Lung volumes, your lung itself inside of you has a volume of its own. So it's kind of like a balloon. And before we start, if you guys have any questions, you can please talk through the mic or just type it out in the chat. I can see all of the chat over here. So your lung has its volume on its own, like this here. So the normal volume of your lung is after this, the expiratory reserve volume. This is the normal volume of your lung. If you expire more, so like you're normally just expiring. If you expire more after you've already expired, like this, you're over expiring, then you're leaving out this expiratory reserve volume and you're left only with the residual volume. So your lungs are this, when you're expiring, it becomes like this, it goes back like this. And when you're expiring even more, you're forcing yourself to expire, it goes back into like this. But it doesn't ever close in 100% all the way. There's always some volume left out in there. And this volume, we call it the residual volume. And then after you expire, so we said the normal lungs are like this. If you expire, they become larger like this, and then they go back. This expansion and going back to the normal state is called the tidal volume. So this is the volume of you normally breathing. This is the volume of you forcefully expiring out the air. And if you normally breathing, that you don't breathe all the way. You're not bringing your lungs 100% all over the way. What you're doing is essentially you're just doing half a liter of volume. If you want to go over that, say for example you're hemorrhaging, say for example you're low on oxygen. So what you do is you're inspiring even more. So you're inspiring in excess, and that is called the inspiratory reserve volume. So you're expiring even more. So like I'm normally inspiring like this. If you want to inspire more, you're doing like this. So this is, for example, you're going down under the water, so you need more oxygen. So what you do, you're using this reserve. You're never using this entire expiratory reserve, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve. You're only using the tidal volume at all times, and the expiratory and the inspiratory are there in cases of emergencies. So, for example, you're not breathing like unless after you're walking or after you're running. So you ran a long time. So you ran for quite a few kilometers. Now you're very low on oxygen. So what you do, you need a lot of oxygen. You need a lot of ventilation. So then you're using your expiratory reserve volume and the respiratory reserve volume. And moving from there, how do we measure those? And we'll get to why they're important in a bit. But first, how do we measure them? Measuring them is basically this water. This is called a spirometer. The water in here is only for isolation so that the air doesn't get trapped out, but it's basically like a balloon. This is a chamber of air and the tube going up to you, and you're closing the nose of the patient so that you make sure that there's no air leaking out. What happens basically is once you do this, the patient is inhaling in, the air goes in, so this goes up and this pen goes up. So you have to memorize like most of the spirometer. I did solve most of your past papers. The spirometer is not really the part of the question. It's mostly how this the spirograph comes out at the end. So you have to remember or have to memorize that the most important part here is that the expiration is down, your maximal expiration is underneath here, and the maximum inspiration is up in here. So you don't mistake them both together for inspiration and expiration. Sorry. All right. So you have to remember that inspiration is up, expiration is down. And this is the tidal volume we talked about. It's half a liter. So you're always just taking in and out half a liter of volume. If you, for example, this is after you're running or after something, you maximally expired, then you take a maximum inspiration. So you're going down into the RV, which is the residual volume, the minimum volume. Your lungs can't go below this. So memorize the residual volume is the physiological minimum, because then we'll talk about the minimal lung volume afterwards, which is the actual minimum of the lung that the lungs are trying to get to. So this is the physiological minimum. This on a normal daily basis, you can't, the RV is the least you can get out of your lung. And then you go up to this, which is the TLC or the total lung capacity, and then you drop back down. So we'll talk now about the capacities. And for the amounts of volumes, you do have to know them. They're very important. So how do we measure? Okay, sorry. So how do we measure these volumes other than the spirometer? We can also calculate an individual volume, such as, for example, the RV. And Dr. Shams loves to use the inert gas dilution method to check out for RV, for the RV volume, rather than just any volume, generally speaking. But this works for any volume. So what you do is you got the spirometer from before. It has everything in it, except you add in 10 molars of helium. So basically, you add in some amount of helium in there, and what happens is this this amount of helium you divide it by the amount you divide it by the space, so it gives you the density of the helium in that air. So you know the density of the helium in the air, and we know that the amount of the helium can never decrease or increase, so it's always the same. So the amount before is always equal to the amount after. So you added 10 particles of helium here. After you open the valve, some of that helium will go into the patient's lungs. And so the 10 more particles, maybe eight are still here, and two go there. You know the total is always the same. So the amount before is equal to the amount after. So what you do is density times the volume, because you know the original volume of this spirometer is equal to the density times the volume, the new volume. I personally would prefer if you do it as density times volume, and then because you already know, oh, okay, so the new combined volume is the volume of the lung and the volume of the spirometer. So you subtract the volume of the lung from the new total volume. Sorry, subtract the volume of the spirometer from the total volume, so you get the volume of the lung. Or Dr. Shams loves to do it like this: volume of spirometer plus volume of the lungs. This specific formula in and of itself, you don't really need to memorize it. None of the formulas you really need to memorize as long as you understand the concept. The brilliance of lung mechanics and like lungs in general and pulmonary is you get to understand everything in it. خلاص, you understand and you memorize everything. You don't need to spend time memorizing if you understand the topic. So uh, we go from here. We have now the lung volumes. So lung volumes are the stuff we talked about already, the RV, the expiratory reserve, these inspiratory reserve. These are volumes. These are in the normal ranges that we talk about. Then we have capacities. A capacity is basically two or more volumes added together. So it's an artificial concept we made up to actually just like measure out the patient's vitals. So for example, here we have the inspiratory reserve. Below this is the expiratory reserve. See this line here? It's like 1.5 because this is the RV. RV is about 1.5 liters. This is the least that the patient can get under physiological conditions. And this is the inspiratory reserve. And this here, the squiggly line in here, this is the tidal volume. You're going up and down in this tidal volume. So inspiratory capacity is basically the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve. And this is all you can inspire. So basically, all you can expire from normal expiration up to maximal inhalation. And then we have the functional residual capacity, which is the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume. So you go from here, from normal expiration to excess of expiration and the volume of the lung that's remaining. So you go, and then there's still some volume inside, so you add that to the amount that you just expired. And the vital capacity. Vital capacity and TLC are the most important, which is the total lung capacity. Total lung capacity is, from the name goes, it's the total lung volume at the maximum inhalation. خلاص, this is the most you can ever get. And vital capacity is important as well because this is the most you can expire or the most you can breathe, basically. So if you take in from maximal expiration to maximal inhalation, this is the most you'll ever get. So this is the most you'll ever get. And this is exactly what we do, for example, after running, after stress testing. So if you're doing anything physical activity, physically demanding, this is what you're expiring and inhaling, not the tidal volume. So think of it as the older brother of of the vital capacity. And TLC is important diagnostically, which we'll get to in a bit. So generally speaking, these you have to memorize the capacities and which ones make each one. But the most important are the vital capacity and the total lung capacity. In terms of maturation, we as humans age, and as we age, we grow. So if you grow as a human, if you grow as a person, your lungs grow as well. So basically, up to about 20 years of age, your lungs get to 100%. خلاص, we're up to full volume. We're not expanding anymore. And the problem is here, like how your old grandpa would be coughing all around, or he cannot like breathe well. Allah يحفظكم يا عم, but like they can't breathe well. This is because the residual volume is also increasing. Why? Because of deterioration of the tissue, which we'll get to right now. So basically, the residual volume is also increasing, like over here. And so the total lung capacity is increased. Like say here at the 20-year-old guy, the total lung capacity is increased compared to an 18-year-old, for example. But the vital capacity of the 18-year-old is greater than the 20-year-old, which is also greater than that of a very old person whose maturation is overdone and the total lung capacity is constant, but the RV is still increasing because there is tissue deterioration. As you're aging, your tissues are deteriorating, and so the residual volume increases. So these here, the ideal gas law is BV equal nRT. This is the most, it's not the most important, but this is a very important law you have to memorize. This is basically chemistry. Like you guys took ideal gas law before in chemistry. This is the exact same concept. However, here we're subtracting the H2O because we're not measuring the moist air. Moist air is not ideal gas, and a lot of like more chemical details we'll talk about later into, or like if you're really into that, this is not really the most important thing here. The important thing is just subtracting the pressure of the water vapor, and then you have PV equal MRT or NRT, and the body temperature, pressure, and the ambient saturation, these are not important. He even mentioned that he's not bringing them in the exam. However, we'll go to this here. You can memorize them as follows. So PV equal NRT equal, so if he ever asks about anything, you can find it out by dividing the two volumes. So for example, it's just mathematics. If you want ATPS, you can just multiply by the denominator being VATPS. So these cancel out. The VATPS will cancel out with the ATPS, and you're left only with the VBTPS, which is the equation you put in the numerator. And this time over that, and you get the equation out. He's generally never really asked about them, so don't really worry about them. But if you're mathematically savvy, then why not? You might as well just study those as well. In terms of lung pathologies, you don't really need to know the underlying stuff, the minute details and the diseases. Of course, you just need the big titles. So skeletal abnormalities, basically, what makes you expire and inspire? Inspiration is pushed actively. So you're not just, the lungs need to be forcefully pushed out to create the negative pressure and get the air inside. We'll talk about it in a bit. So generally speaking, like from your anatomy lectures, that there are muscles like the diaphragm, for example, and the intercostal muscles. They're pushing your lungs out to get in more air. So if you have a problem with the muscles, basically you can't push out the lungs anymore. You can't just distend them any further. And in total, you can't breathe. So this is the skeletal abnormality. And same as the weak respiratory muscles. Sorry. The weak respiratory muscles, what I explained. The skeletal abnormalities is like the bones themselves are weak. So, for example, yeah, like your ribs are not working properly, or like your sternum is weak. You can't then actually breathe properly. Lung diseases, we'll get to them. Mostly, you have to know them as obstructive lung disease or restrictive lung disease. The obstructive, we'll get to them. Restrictive, we'll get to them. But generally speaking, obstructive, it's hard to exhale. Restrictive, it's hard to inhale. You're restricted in breathing. The obstructive, you're obstructed from breathing out. And then severe airway obstructions. He generally meant here restrictive and here obstruction, but also most of this he doesn't really bring out. This we'll get to here. We have the what's it called? All right, so we have the diseases here. Why do we do the whole volumes thing? Okay, it's great to study physiology and whatever. We're not. We're doctors. We need to study the actual clinicians and like how to treat people and how to diagnose them. So what we're doing here is have two general categories of diseases which we have to know in pulmo, which is obstructive lung disease and restrictive lung disease. Obstructive lung disease, basically, is obstructed, meaning the tissue is not being the tissue is being deteriorated. So for example, in here, this is how emphysema works. This is the normal tissue. This is the normal thickness of the tissue. If you have emphysema, someone who's been smoking for 20, 30 years, all of these chemical irritants, all of this inflammation, what does he do? Or what does this does to his body? Is basically it thins out the tissue and it becomes more like instead of a balloon, it becomes like a plastic bag. It's easier to just inhale, to just like inflate out and get in. We'll get to that in lung mechanics, but for now, know that obstructive lung disease, it's destroying, for example, like the emphysema here, it's destroying the tissue here. So basically, you're thinning out the tissue, you're decreasing the elasticity of the tissue, so you're ruining your tissue. In the case of restrictive lung disease, what you have is something like asthma. Sorry, not asthma, is like pulmonary fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is the exact opposite. This here, this is the normal tissue. This here is thinned out tissue and destroyed tissue. In the fibrosis, these cells or the epithelia, you should know from like a histology that these are here epithelia, these actually become fibrosed. Fibrosed as in they become extended or thickened. So when they're thickened, they're harder to pump. Think of like a tire of the car. So tires of the cars, you can't just blow them out with your mouth or with your own lungs. It has to have higher pressure. So it becomes harder to inflate them. So when you think about it, this restrictive lung disease, it's harder to inflate the lung because now they're fibrous, now they're thickened. You can't inflate them as easily. The muscles have to do extra work to inflate. So basically, you have a problem in inspiring the air because the lung is harder to expand because it's thicker. In the case of emphysema, for example, the tissue is thinner, and so it's easy to fill it up, but at the same time, it's very hard to expire out the air because the lung collapses. These alveoli literally collapse on themselves and they trap in the air, and you can't bring out the air. You can't expire the air out. So restrictive, you have fibrosis. The tissue gets larger, it gets thickened, and the elasticity of let's say compliance because we'll get to that in now in like in a minute. The compliance here actually decreases. But here in the emphysema, the compliance increases, the tissue decreases in size, and you have a problem in expiring the air. So what happens here now? We know, okay, now we said obstructive lung disease, we have a problem in expiring the air. So what happens? Naturally, when you can't expire the air stays in your lungs. So when it does stay in your lung, then you have a greater the total lung capacity increases because halas, the air is trapped inside. So if the lung were like this, they become like this. So they get expanded. But we said, and no, what when you're doing expiration, the lung is too flimsy, the tissue is too thin that it becomes collapsed. So when it collapses, the air gets trapped and you can't expire the air out. So the RV increases as well. This air, trapped air, adds to the residual volume, which is the minimum volume of the lung. So basically, you have trapped air in your lungs that you can't expire out. But in the case of the restrictive lung disease, the lungs are thickened. They're very thick. They're very hard to expand. So what happens is when you expire, you can't expire fully. So by time, the TLC, the total lung volume, decreases, and the RV decreases, but everything decreases in the same situation. Nothing is collapsing. Nothing is happening. So then the ratio at the end of the restrictive lung disease is normal because everything is reduced in the same amount. It's just harder to breathe. It's really hard to breathe, but everything is still normal. All of these volumes are exactly the same in terms of proportions. But in the obstructive lung disease, we said that the alveoli collapse on themselves and they can't breathe that air out. So the residual volume increases more than even the total lung capacity increases. So we get that the RV over the TLC value increases as well. So if you have to just memorize here specifically because he loves these questions. If you don't even understand it 100%, if you just memorize that the obstructive increases the lung, it's easier to inspire than to expire. So it increases the capacity, but the air gets trapped, so the RV is even more. So the RV over TLC is higher. Restrictive, it's the lung is thickened, it can't expand it as much. So the TLC is decreased, you can't expand as much, and the RV is just the same. Nothing happens, no collapse, no anything. So the total is normal, or the RV over TLC is normal. What we do after this, we have, sorry. So now we're done with, sorry, we're done with the volumes. Now into the juicy part, which is the lung mechanics. So what happens with lung mechanics, or actually let's show this part first. Here you can kind of understand this a bit better if you want to look at it here. The in the restrictive lung disease, everything gets decreased in the same amount, even inspired or expired. This you don't have to know, but it's just all gets reduced by the same proportions. But here in the obstructive, it gets the TLC, the overall gets increased. But here you see the RV, which is the minimum volume, it also gets increased. So really, in reality, your patient is suffocating while being alive because خلاص, they can't, whatever they do, okay, they're bringing in the air, but they can't do anything with the air because it's trapped inside. And this air is full of carbon dioxide, so it's basically not ventilating them. If we go to the juicy part of the lung mechanics, we'll get here. First of all, what's the pressure doing? Because pressure happens, or let's speak of balloons first. You guys like balloons, I suppose. So why does a balloon expand? That's a very normal question, and I think most of you guys know it, but if you don't, for the sake of knowing, I guess, when you وش اسمه? When you inflate a balloon, you're basically putting more air into it. So there is more pressure. But really, what's pressure? Because this is really important in pulmon because everything revolves around pressure. Some cases you can't do things if there is pressure or if there is air movement because it's pressure. So what's pressure? Pressure is basically these air molecules are colliding with the walls of the balloon, expanding it out. At the same time, remember, air around you exists. So outside of the balloon, there are also air molecules that are pushing in on the balloon. So it's basically a balance between air molecules pushing in and air molecules pushing out. So you get an equilibrium. Think of it. How do I increase the size of the balloon? I am a lung. I need to expand. I need to inspire. How do I increase the size? Oh, that was not meant for. Okay, how do you increase the size? The size increases is either you're increasing the volume, you're increasing the amount of air particles inside, so you're pushing the air inside, and when you do that, you're basically expanding the volume because you're increasing the pressure inside, or you decrease the pressure outside, like from here, you're decreasing the pressure from the outside so that the molecules from inside don't face any resistance. They can just inflate the balloon as much as they want, and so you go up to a higher volume. If you go to it like in a more natural sense, if you actually inflate a balloon in space, يعني in ideal scenarios, it will actually inflate infinitely until there is no more volume. يعني to a certain extent, but this is the idea. So you have to know that things expand because there is a difference in the pressure between a compartment in and a compartment out. So there is a difference here between PI and PO. Decrease PO, so the pressure is higher in PI. So we try to get an equilibrium where PI is equal to PO. So we increase the volume. When we increase the volume, the amount of air particles that are inside that are pushing at the wall at the same time is decreasing. So we get an equal pressure between the two. This gets us to the transmural pressure, which is basically PI minus PO. So you're subtracting the pressure from inside to the pressure outside. And then we get to compliance. Someone thought to himself, okay, what happens if I if I plug the volume against the pressure difference, which is the PI minus the PO. So what happens here is you're basically this PI versus VO, this is a compliance curve. The best thing about it, or the thing we want out of this, is the slope of the curve. So the slope of the curve here would be the increase in the volume, y over x. So increase in volume over increase in pressure, in transmural pressure, and difference between them outside. So you'll find something. If you increase the pressure, for example, here, up to a point, the balloon gets very filled up. And you know when when you're inflating a balloon, it gets this big, but it's not inflating anymore. It's because the compliance decreases with time, or decreases with volume, sorry. So as you're inflating it more, as the volume increases, the compliance here, the slope, the x, see how the y is decreasing. So the y here is greatest for the lowest x. And then once you increase the volume very much, the volume decreases compared to the transmural pressure. So your compliance overall decreases. This makes you this plateau curve. So it plateaus. So for example, say I have a balloon, I stretch it out. At first, it's stretching out very easily. Why? The compliance is very high. But at very larger areas or at very larger expansions, the balloon is very hard to expand because I got to the point of no point of expansion. There is no more tissue to expand or there is no more balloon to expand out of. So the compliance is very low and I have to apply a lot of pressure or a lot of force to actually get that balloon to expand any further. All right. Do you guys have any questions about this point? I know it can be this is just the start, but I know compliance can get a bit tricky. Do you guys have any questions? If you do, send on the text or just open your mic, عادي. All right. I'll take that as a no. So we studied compliance. Compliance is great. We know compliance now. How do we do compliance in medicine? Because we're doctors. Back again. So here, this is the lung. The lung has a pressure inside of it, which is the alveolar. We call it the alveolar pressure. The lung is not just the lungs. You took anatomy. It's not just lungs. There is pleura around it. The pleura and then the chest wall. So the chest wall here, this is what we call the pleural pressure. The name pleura. So we have alveolar pressure, which is inside of the lungs. We have pleural pressure, which is outside, right outside of the lungs, which is between the lungs and the chest wall. And we have the overall pressure, which we'll talk now about, which is the respiratory system's pressure. So if you want to compare, we said that we subtracting pressure in minus pressure out. But here we basically have two balloons inside of each other. We have the lungs, which is itself a balloon, inside of the chest wall, which is itself a balloon. And if you don't think of your chest wall as a balloon, trust me, I used to think like that as well. If you look into anatomy, you'll find that the chest is expanding with you while you're expiring and is compressing when you're expiring. So it is a balloon to a certain extent. It's expiring and inspiring, like increasing in size and decreasing in size to a certain extent, along with you inspiring and expiring. I think Dr. Elena should be teaching that or taught you that, guys, is your ribs are literally just being separated like this outwards. So your volume of the chest wall is increasing and decreasing. So we have to think of it as a balloon as well. It's a very low compliance balloon. Don't get that wrong. So like the lungs here, for example, are like just what's it called? A rubber balloon. The chest wall are like a bony balloon. So don't think of it as very easy to contract and extract, to expire and inspire, but it's a balloon after all. So when you do this, you'll find that okay, we have three pressures basically. We have the alveolar pressure, we have the pleural pressure, and we have the atmospheric pressure, which is right after out this, like in the air around us. So what do we do? Which ones do we count as the in pressure and which ones do we count as the out pressure to get the compliance of these or to actually just get anything out of this? So we have to think of it as three different systems. It's first the lungs versus the pleura, or the lungs inside of the body as themselves, or the lungs, or sorry, or the pleura against the entire against the atmospheric pressure outside of it. So the pleural pressure against the atmospheric pressure outside, or the overall system, the overall lungs and the pleura and the chest wall and everything against the atmospheric pressure. So then we're doing PA, which is the alveolar, minus the atmospheric pressure as well. So what you find here is basically if you want to do you don't want to do the compliance because this is important diagnostically as well. We'll get that the compliance is equal to change in the volume. So given a volume, it's like just like the curve we talked about before, here you change a volume, you increase the volume somewhat, some volume, you get a change in pressure between the two. So in the case of the alveolar pressure and the pulmonary pressure, there are ways to measure them. We'll talk about them in a bit as well. So this is for the lung one. So the compliance for the lung on its own, as a lung, as an organ, we do it as change in pressure over change in the alveolus over change in the pleura. This is the stuff we just talked about. The chest wall, we do the exact same thing. It's the same idea we just talked about at the last slide. You're doing the pleura minus the atmospheric pressure. And for the respiratory system, we're doing the alveolar minus the atmospheric pressure instead of the pleura. We're just kind of ignoring the pleura and we get the overall compliance. There is a trick here though. or not a trick, it's a fun part actually. It's like a mathematical thing. You're reducing this atmospheric pressure or assuming it's zero. You can just bring it back to zero and assume that you're just living in space. It doesn't change anything, or that it approximately doesn't exist. And from there, we can just go on with the same reference. And so you just do the change in the volume over the change in the volume for the chest wall, for example, over the pleural pressure. Whatever the pleural pressure is, this is what you divide by. You don't have to consider the atmospheric pressure and all of that. We're just neutralizing it, or basically reduce, assuming it's zero. Not assuming, it's yeah, more like shifting the mathematical perspective to zero. But saying overall, you can just skip it and assume it as zero. All right. So say for example, you have the chest wall compliance and the lung compliance. What do? You want to find the respiratory systems compliance. I mean, okay, it does not seem intuitive, but this might be a question as well because if you have the chest compliance and the chest wall compliance and the lung compliance, you can just always find the respiratory systems overall compliance. But in some scenarios, you'll have to use these chest wall compliance and the and the lung compliance to find the respiratory or the overall without breaking them down back into the volume and the pressure. And in that case, we're using this equation, which is 1 over the respiratory system equal to the 1 over the lungs plus 1 over the compliance of the chest wall. Why are we doing this? As an overall arching idea is because it's a serial system, a lung inside of a lung. This is more physics. So you have a lung inside of a lung. So this is what we do with serial systems. Or if you think about it a bit more smartly, you can find out that this is basically dV over dBBL. We want to find dV, the same dV here, d over dPA. So you can just use these as like the dV and the dBA minus BBL. You can basically like mathematically manipulate them until you get to the same exact equation. If you flip this and you flip this and add them together and then flip it over just right here, and then flip it all over, you'll find the CRS. But generally speaking, you still don't need that. You just need the equation. This is for you as an extra information, I guess, if you're really into that mathematical part. So we're back with the spirometer. Okay, we said what is a spirometer? It's basically a balloon. This here is a balloon connected to a tube to your patient's lungs. At first, this balloon is closed, so we know the size of the spirometer. We know the size of the balloon here, and then we compare it to the after all size of the patient as well, of like the lung of the patient as well. But what if we don't do it against time? Spirometer gives us against time. Remember, tidal volume goes up and down. Maximum expiration, maximal inhalation, you go up and down with time. It's respect to time. Here, we're doing the same thing, but this is called the pressure volume curve. Think compliance. We're going back to the compliance. We're trying to curve out compliance. So this is basically the same thing we did here, but this is the balloon. We want to get it to what's it called? We're gonna get it to the point of human anatomy or human physiology, which is the lungs. So we do exact same thing in the spirometer, but add over here this part, which is a which is a barometer. It gives you the pressure relative to the atmospheric pressure. This is why we say it's zero, because even here, for example, we're measuring it relative to the atmospheric pressure. So it's basically as if the atmospheric pressure is zero because you're always measuring relative to it. But back again here, you have the pressure from the spirometer. So this is like a modified spirometer that has a barometer as well, or like a measuring device that tells you how much the pressure is inside against the volume. So the spirometer is measuring the volume, and you have the barometer attached to it, giving you the pressure as well. Or there is an endoscope, which we'll talk about as well. But generally speaking, this is how we do it: spirometer with a barometer, the barometer giving you the pressure. This is giving you the volume. Why are we doing this? We're trying to get a pressure volume curve. Why is this pressure volume curve important? Because of compliance. Compliance is basically what? It's volume over pressure. I want pressure over volume, I do this. So when we do it an overall as for the entire system, back to the compliance of the respiratory system, you'll find that it gives you this curve. This is the alveolar pressure. So as you're increasing or decreasing the pressure inside of the patient's lungs, and this is the volume. So what's happening here? Why is it an S curve? Does any of you guys know? All right. So basically, it's giving you an S curve because we'll get to that in a point. I wanted to see if you guys wanted to see it or wanted to know it more. But basically, what we have here is if you go up here, this is like a protection mechanism. Subhanallah, salaha. You get up to here, the compliance gets very low, just like with the balloon. It gets very low to a point of you can't expand anymore. And this is a protective mechanism because realistically, the what was it called? The chest wall can increase more or the lungs can decrease less. But overall, you wanted to maintain a certain level of anatomical correction. So we have this as an artificial limit. So this is not really the natural one. This is an artificial one made by the anatomy of the human system to prevent the lungs from overinflating and exploding, or for example, from preventing it from decompressing completely all the way. And this is exactly why we have the RV, which is the respiratory reserve, or sorry, respiratory volume. So this is why we have the RV, because there is a system in place, which we'll talk about now, that is preventing the lungs from decompressing further and going back to their original size that they want to be at, which is the minimum lung volume. So if we go over there, we'll find out that, okay, this is the pressure volume curve. We said again, compliance is the slope of this. So where is the slope highest or greatest? It's over here. What's this? Why is it dashed now? Wasn't it just a sigmoid function? Or you said this, if you have to memorize these curves. Like the topics about the curves are literally derived from the curves. If you just memorize, like etch the picture of the curve in your head, you'll be able to solve all the questions about this. So for the example, the part before this, the respiratory system has a sigmoid curve, which is an S curve. We love to call it a sigmoid or an S curve. Just memorize it as an S curve. So it looks like this and it's going down. This is like a slightly shifted up curve, S. So what happens here is we said the respiratory system as a whole is actually two systems, and we add them together to make the third, which is the lung and the chest wall. So if we look at the curve of the lung specifically, we find that it looks like this. So if you look at it, you'll find that the compliance is actually lowest near the TLC. What's the TLC? It's the total lung capacity. And where is the minimum volume? Where is it trying to get to? It's actually trying to get to about 300 milliliters, which is what we call the minimum lung volume. So you have to remember that the minimum lung volume is different from the residual volume. Minimum lung volume is about 300 milliliters. The residual volume is 1,500 milliliters. Why do we have that difference? It's because of the anatomy, which is in here. We'll get to that. So basically, what's happening here is in realistic situations, the volume of the object is always trying to get to the highest compliance possible. So from here, for example, if your volume is over here, it's like a ball rolling down an alleyway or like down a hill. It's trying to go down, 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 and reach the highest compliance. So it's going from whatever point of compliance it's at, trying to reach the highest compliance, which is over here. So do we really want it to be less than RV? We don't want that. We don't want the lungs to be 100% collapsed. That's not a good thing. So what do? We have the chest wall to thank for that, which what happens here, you can find that it's almost an S curve, not really an S curve. The way I love to memorize this is that they are two halves of an S curve. So if you take this, for example, and take it out to here, you'll find that they complete each other. They're making an S curve on their own. This plus that makes you the S curve of the respiratory system as a whole. So if we go back here, you'll find out that the compliance here, where is the compliance highest? It's right over here, which is about, you have to memorize this value as well, it's about 60 to 50% of the total lung capacity. So it's over here. So if you have something in here, so say like the volume is about, I don't know, like about 2 liters of the chest wall, it's always trying to go back up to 4.5. So we said this one wants to expand always, and the other one, or almost always, because we never all really at 6. And the other one, the lung volume, it wants to decrease, it wants to collapse on itself. So what happens when we combine both of them? This is what we get, which is basically like we'll get to the black bars in a bit because they're a bit confusing here. If you look at the curve here, you'll find that this is the chest wall curve and this is the lung curve. So again, remember them as the S curve. So you'll find what makes up the lower half of the S curve is the chest wall. What makes up the upper half of the S curve of the respiratory system is the lungs. It's like this and like this. So try to memorize the curves. Because now when we say what made the original plateau, we said that this is a protective mechanism. This is not the normal of the lung. The lungs is like the lungs on themselves, they have a curve curving upwards, just the second half, this half. Where did this come from? This came from the chest wall. So you have to remember this part comes from the chest wall. This part comes from the lungs. So, and we said this is protection and this is protection. So protection from overexpansion, the volume is overexpanded. This comes from what? Comes from the lungs. But protection from from under what's it called? Sorry, from over inspiration. Sorry, the volume is increased. So protection from over inspiration, the volume is too much. What's protecting you from doing that? It's the lungs, because they're always trying to get back low. They're trying to get back to their minimal lung volume, which is about 300 milliliters. When you get it up to 6 liters, it's fully inflated, and the compliance is very low that you can't inflate it anymore. And this is protecting the lungs from being لا قدر الله انه they're pop. So in the case of deflation, what happens? So basically, this is the chest wall. It's doing the exact same thing, but in the opposite direction. So this is protecting from maximum expiration. So what's protecting overall? What's protecting from maximum inspiration? It's the lungs. What's protecting from maximum inhalation, from maximum expiration? It's the chest wall. So if you get back to this, so if you notice, this is about 60% of the TLC. So we said anything that's at any point of the curve is trying to always reach whatever the object is. If it's here on the curve, it's trying to reach here. If it's over here on the curve, it's trying to reach here, because this is the point of highest compliance. So what happens when we measure these two? So this is trying to get down, or like to reduce in volume. And these are, yeah, generally speaking, trying to increase the volume. What happens? We have a decrease with an increase. You're basically just adding the two forces together. And so the force of the increase and the force of the decrease are going together simultaneously, and you meet in the middle. This middle happens to be the FRC. What was the FRC again? You guys, what was the FRC, guys? Do you guys remember? All right, so the FRC was the volume of the RV, which is the residual volume, and the inspiratory reserve volume, and the inspiratory reserve volume. So sorry, expiratory reserve volume. So this is the RV. This is what you have at any times, at any time. So what happens in here is, if you see this, this is the pressure, this is the pressure. If we're at this point, this curve has greater pressure because this is the pressure here. We're measuring only this line. If you look at the black line in this position, if the lung volume or if the chest volume is at this position over here on the curve of the original black curve, if it's at this point, you'll find that this line is way greater than this line. The line of the pressure of the chest wall is trying to always increase the pressure, or sorry, increase the volume, and the line of the pressure of the lungs is always trying to decrease it. But here, the pressure from the lungs is not as great as the pressure from the chest wall, so it's basically increasing the volume back up. What you need to get out of this is basically you have one up, one down, and they meet in the middle. So this one wants to decrease, this one wants to increase, and they meet at the middle, which is called the FRC. And this is exactly where the alveolar pressure is equal to 0, because it's equal to the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure. So, and concept about this is, if you basically have, sorry, not this. If you go back here and look at this, okay, so we said when you're inspiring, the volume is going up. What happens when it's going up is basically you have to forcefully expire, because so it goes up. It's not going to go up on its own. It's never going up on its own. The lungs or the system overall, the respiratory system overall, just wants to go back to the highest compliance, which is about FRC, because we said, no, this is the chest wall, this is the lungs, they're combined together. One is trying to increase, one is trying to decrease. So we combine them together, we get into a middle point called the FRC. So it will never expand on its own. So what we have to do is use our diaphragm. The diaphragm is expanding the volume. It's pushing down like this, so it expands the volume of the lungs. We're using the intercostal muscles to expand out as well. So we get the lungs to expand in the volume, and we get the volume up. So this is active. The pressure, the movement upwards is active. It's just like you're moving up a hill. You have to move it up, but once you leave it up there, it will go simultaneously on its own back to that normal level. So it goes, if you leave it at here, if your muscles push your respiratory system volume up to this point, and then you just relax your muscles, all of the respiratory system volume will go back to FRC on their own, just by the elastic potential, or like just the, what's it called? Yeah, like contractility of the compliance of the system. I will go on its own back to FRC. So why is that important again? Or that kind of explains why we have a respiratory volume, a tidal volume, and a respiratory reserve and expiratory reserve, because you can always push your lungs forward. You can always push your lungs downwards. You can push your lung to expire more air, or you can push your lungs to inspire more air. But realistically, that's not what happens. What happens is inspiration is just a tiny bit that's actually done, and then the expiration is done passively and not excessively. So this extra part from FRC down to RV, this is why we call it an expiratory reserve, because this does not normally happen, and it's not physiological. When you're doing that, it's actually pathological. Or not pathological, it's not the normal of the patient. So this is, for example, this is very tied in with Dr. Ulina's chest wall lectures. So what happens here? We said that we have two systems. We combine them to the third. The system here is the lung system here, or like the lung kinematics or the compliance here, and we have the chest wall here. So what happens is, if, for example, you have a stab, someone stabbed you between your ribs, and it happens. If someone stabbed you, the chest wall is now open to the parametric pressure. Once it's open, all of the air from outside will flush inside, and now you have an equal pressure between the two. And the what's it called? And the alveolar pressure would then have to collapse, because all of this air from the sky or from the air around you pushed into the pleural pressure, the pleura, and increase the pressure over there, that the lungs have collapsed. So basically, you collapsing the lungs. If you have a wound in your chest wall, the lungs, the pleural pressure increases, and so the lung system is disrupted, because now you're subtracting from the from the atmospheric, not from the pleural pressure, and you get a decrease in the lung volume, and your lungs are collapsed. How do you restore this? You're restoring the pleural volume. You're adding a suction tube or something. You're adding a tube in here. You suck out the extra air that was rushed in from the atmospheric pressure, and you're back at whatever, like -6 centimeters H2O, which is like the negative pressure of the pleura, the normal negative pressure of the pleura, and your lungs are back to normal, and you should just seal the wound, or like seal the opening, so you don't go back, obviously. So we said emphysema. Now we're done with compliance. This is like the biggest part, balloons and everything. Now we're into changes in compliance with disease. We did all of that compliance stuff. Again, importance comes here. So we said we have obstructive lung disease and restrictive lung disease. The obstructive and the restrictive. Obstructive, you're thinning out the tissue. It becomes harder to expire, and so you have higher RV and TLC. That was what we said. Obstructive, you're thickening the tissue. That you're getting fibrosed, for example. You're thickening the tissue. The compliance, when you have a thicker balloon, is just exactly like when you have a balloon. It's a thicker balloon, so you can't push in air as much. So the compliance becomes lower. It's less compliant with you. In the case of emphysema, you're damaging the tissue, so the tissue becomes flimsy. It's literally like paper. So what happens then? It becomes very compliant, and then when you just push in any air, it literally just expands without any limits. So if you measure the compliance of a patient, and you find it abnormally high, that means the tissue is very flimsy. It's very compliant with you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care. It's just gonna expand. And this is indicative of obstructive lung disease. This is indicative, for example, of emphysema. If you, for example, the compliance of the patient, he's trying his might to actually expire to what's called to breathe, and the compliance is actually lower than normal or the normal range, then you're expecting restrictive lung disease. You're expecting fibrosis. Fibrosis thicken. The thickened wall is literally harder. It's harder to expand, and so it's less compliant. It's not as expansible. So it's fibrosed. So this is why we're doing this. Nothing in pulmonary is done just for the sake of doing it. It's always back to an end, which is the clinical side. So for example, the volumes, we did that to find the clinical value. Here, compliance, we did that to find the clinical value in actually diagnosing the patients. So here, compliance of the lung, we're done with the compliance as an overall idea. We're into the factors that determine the compliance, because it's not just about the thickness or the flimsiness of the tissue. It's about a couple of other things, because you're not a balloon after all, you have actual lungs. So elasticity of the tissue in here plays a role. So it's like, just as we said, like the thickness, you can think of it as the thickness or the type of the material. Some materials are not really that expansive or that compliant to expansion. Some others are really compliant. And principles of interdependence of alveoli, surface tension, and surfactants. Surfactants and surface tension are kind of the same topic. We'll go to them now into more details. So elasticity of the tissue. This is basically, like doctor was trying to show you guys here, that there's elastic fibers. So these elastic fibers are what gives the lungs its leeway or its ability to just expand and contract. Otherwise, it wouldn't actually extract, like wouldn't go up and down. It would just be a box, just fixed in place. It's not contracting. It's not contracting. It's not expanding. It's just fixed in place. So these are actually like what's it called? The elastic tissue or the elastic fibers are what's giving it this leeway and making it able to expand and contract. So yeah, so generally speaking, why is this important? Again, if you have a disease targeting your elastic tissue, what happens then? The elastic tissue is ruined. You're not able to contract or expand as much. It's gone. So then probably you have the reduced compliance. Reduced compliance is restrictive. In restrictive cases, we give different management. So this is why it's important. Here, it's interdependence of alveoli. And the concept of interdependence is literally means that the walls of the alveoli, like here, for example, they're stuck to each other. So they're interdependent because they're attached to one another. So what happens is, if one of them is decreased in size, the other is increased in size. Why is this important? Because if this one, for example, say it collapses, because we said lungs have tendency to collapse with like the expiration, and you'll see in a bit why specifically, because this is like part of a different lecture later on. But generally speaking, if they here get compressed like this, the others around it are increasing in size. So we said increase in volume. What happens? Compliance decreases. This collapsed one has a very high compliance. So the fact that they are connected to one another, that one of them, once one of them decreases, the others have to increase. That means that the decreased compliance in here and the increased compliance from here cancel out at the end, and you have basically a healthy tissue or a healthy lung to a certain extent. So this is also a protective mechanism from the lungs that prevents you from for example, from this this broke down or collapsed. We have high compliance and you can't do anything about it. Khalas, you can't do anything. No, you have a protective mechanism around it. Okay, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna expand the alveoli that are around it, like here over here. And when that happens, I increase compliance here, decrease the compliance over here. And so overall, the compliance is the same. This is exactly the same over here. You increase the compliance. This one, for example, something for some reason made your alveoli expand in size. What happens in the surrounding ones? They're pushed inwards. They're decreased in size. So when they're decreased in size, their compliance is actually increased. And this one is centrally increased in compliance. Sorry, decreased in compliance. So again, the overall compliance is the same. Same over again here. The more it's inflated, the more the compliance here. decreases, the more the others around it are gonna get squished. Like now there are two rows of squished alveoli around it, and this one is the most squished. So then you have an even greater increase in compliance to get an overall normal tissue. So now we said, okay, compliance factors affecting it. Four factors. First, the first is we said, okay, we talked about this alveolar interdependence, and we talked about the elasticity. Now we have the effect of the surface tension. So surface tension, there is a better picture over here. So what's basically surface tension? Surface tension is pushing inwards. First of all, you have to remember that surface tension is always pushing your tissue inwards. You have an alveolus like this, it's trying to get everything to get inside. Why? Because water is polar. We're 70% water, so we're basically polar. The lungs are basically water and are surrounded from the inside by water. See, so this brown stuff, this is all water. So what happens is basically, they get attracted to one another. Water molecules, they want to go together with one another. So some of them go inside, and when they go inside, they're trying to decrease the surface area. So how do you get the surface area? See how the surface area here is very great and very large? How do you decrease it? By getting it to be smaller. So if we like replicate this image and literally just like minute it like this, it's trying to compress the alveolus from this size down into this size. So see, all of this surface area is trying to get it compressed into this smaller surface area and increasing the volume. So this is a property of water just because they're attracted to one another. So the surface water molecules there's nothing above them that's trying to get them back up. There is nothing to balance that tension or the force of attraction from the water molecules down here. So they're basically pushed down into the fluid itself, increasing the volume and decreasing the surface. So how does this manifest in the alveolus? You're trying to decrease the surface. See this surface here at this side. They're trying to decrease it. So what happens is it trying to compress the alveolus as overall. This is also a part of why the alveolus has or the alveoli have a tendency for collapsing because of the surface tension and because of all of this around it. And how do we counteract this? Okay, this is not, it's not just okay, this is something that happens in the lungs. No, this is actually something that we act upon. This here, he's trying to talk about the fact that this is filled with water and this is filled with air, and it's easier to fill it with air, with water because it's the same surface, so there's no surface tension. See here, there's if you're just filling it with the same material, there is no surface tension. Surface tension happens because there's a phase difference. There's water and there's water and there's air. So the air is not pulling the water molecules at the surface up. So the water molecules go down into the other water molecules inside and reducing the surface. So if you're filling it with water, it's all the same medium. It's all the same thing. There is no surface tension going on. So it's easier to fill. But in the case of the air, when you're trying to push in air, it's harder to fill because the pressure here, if you're trying to push air in this way and expand the alveoli like this, there's always surface tension because there's a phase difference that's pushing the alveolus against you. So there is resistance against the air, but no resistance against the water. This is not really important, the difference between water and air. Surface tension is definitely important. The difference in filling between water and air is not that important. It's just like explanation's sake. So surfactant and stability of the alveoli. So, okay, we have the surface tension. What do we do with that? We can't just let the water ruin our like magnificent alveoli. So what we do is actually just give it surfactants. So what's a surfactant? You'll remember it from FND, which is over here. What's this? It's a phospholipid. It's a phospholipid bilayer thingy. You don't need the phospholipid bilayer. This is a phospholipid specifically. This is the phosphorus. This is the lipid, two lipid chains. The phosphorus here, if you remember from FND, it's actually positive. Positive stuff or like charged stuff, they are very attracted towards water. They're hydrophilic, so they want to go towards the water. The stuff over here, which is the hydrophobic, the lipid chains, they don't like the water. It's just like when you're mixing water and oil together. They don't like going into the water. So what happens is, it happens like this. the phosphate head, the hydrophilic part, goes in like this. Okay, this is for your convenience sake or for you to understand. You don't really need to understand that they're phosphate heads or what. We talk about the apoproteins in a bit. But generally speaking, there is a hydrophilic part and a hydrophobic part. The hydrophilic part, because it loves the water, will push down here. The hydrophilic part, because it's away from the water, it's pushing the surface tension up there, back again. So okay, we added molecules. So why is it two layered basically? Why not just add a hydrophilic part on its own? Because if we add a hydrophilic part on its own, it will just come in like the other water molecules and get sucked in. But okay, what if we add a hydrophobic on its own? If we add a hydrophobic on its own, it's gonna just be forming a layer outside of the water, just around the water. So if we push in both of them or something that has both of them at the same time, the hydrophilic will be attracted inwards, the hydrophobic will be attracted outwards. It's repelled by the water. It wants to go away. So what happens is overall, we have less surface tension. The water is not getting pulled inwards anymore. There is this forming a surface instead of the water molecules forming the surface of the water film around the alveoli. What happens here is the surfactant is what's forming the water surface and are pushing the surface outwards. They're not getting squished in like the water molecules, and so we don't have the effects of the surface tension, and we don't have the pressure building up and resisting our air filling methodologies, or like here. There is nothing pressuring us inwards anymore because we have the surfactants. So what makes first you have to know two things. Let's talk about surfactants. Surfactants are made by these type of cells. Wait a second. Yes, type 2 alveolar cells. If he brings this picture, it's also important, I guess. Supposedly, I remember he brought it once. So alveolar type 2, this is important. You have to memorize it's alveolar type 2, stored in lamellar bodies, excreted by exocytosis. And there are two mechanisms. It's either that it's released by them or they are degraded by the macrophages. This is the source of the surfactants. But then, okay, we said that they are not, okay, they're deleting out the, what's it called? The surface tension pressure, and they're reducing the amount that the alveoli or that we have to use, that we have to work by the muscles to expand the air. It's easier to fill the lungs with air now because of the presence of the surfactants. So what happens, okay, so the source we talked about, the mechanism of action we talked about. Now we have to know what are they made up of. They're made up of apoproteins, A, B, C, D, and generally speaking, like this part is important. The A is important for excreting feedback control, and the B and C are membrane proteins. Just know that they're made up of apoproteins A, B, and C, and D. This is the most important part. And okay, so this is what they're made up of. They fix up two problems. Okay, we talked about the first problem, which is the collapsing nature. Fix up a second problem, which is basically the alveoli are not constant. The surfactants are not constant. So if you have two alveoli, one that's smaller, one that's larger, they both have the same amount of surfactant, but density is what actually matters in the function of surfactants. So if you have here in the smaller alveolus, if you see there is less density, so this less density, higher density because they have less volume, sorry. So it has less surface, and it's like density per surface. So let's talk about it here. Like they have the same amount. This one is smaller, it has higher density. This one is larger, it has lower density. So the effects of the surfactant are less in the less density than they are in the higher density. Why is this important? Because if, say, for example, one of these expand without a limit, and the other is, for example, blocked, the air is shuffled from this one into that one. And again, why is that important? Because geometrically, overall, two expanded alveoli is better than one large and one small alveolus. This is because the exchange happens over here at the surface of the alveolus. The blood vessels are going around and around and around and around like here. So basically, if you have one very large one, you have a lot of air being wasted and not being used. A lot of air is here in the middle that's not reaching the blood, as opposed if you have two alveoli that are expanded, both of them to the same volume as the one large and one small. so that the blood vessels here, so that blood vessels get more oxygen. This you'll get to again later on in the block. But generally speaking, having two equally filled alveoli is better than having one large and one small. And how does surfactants help with that? As the alveolus gets larger like this, the surfactant density gets decreased, and so their function gets decreased. And so back we get the surface tension back, that's pushing the air instead of out this, the air gets pushed from here to fill up the other smaller alveoli. So this is done, this is done. Surfactant reduce surface tension, increase compliance. Talked about that. Okay, so yeah, increasing the compliance happens because if you decrease the pressure here was against you, was resisting you. We said that if you're trying to fill it up with air, the resistance is against you. There's resistance from the surface tension. So if you remove the surface tension, you're increasing the compliance because there is no more resistance. And then fluid accumulation. This is really a secondary point, but it happens because if you have a surfactant, the fluid is taken up by the surfactant and there is no accumulation of the fluid. And then alveolar size relative uniform, which is better in the ventilation. In the ventilation, you'll take that in the ventilation lectures later on. Source of the surfactants, they're alveolar cells type 2 epithelia, and they get recycled and degraded by the cell type 2 cellular epithelia or by the macrophages. Surfactant, yeah, this is last point. This is not really the most important, but yeah, generally speaking, they're filling up the radius of the alveolus. So if you have an alveoli, for example, they're biological sacs, okay? So they're not perfectly round or anything. So what happens is basically you'll have the surfactant come in here, fill up the grooves, so you have less surface area. So look at this. If this here is an alveolus, and we are looking at this groove without the surfactant, so ignore the surfactant, so you'll find that there's a lot of bumps and a lot of crevices and like going up and down. So overall, the surface area is very large, but if you have a surfactant here, the surface area is way reduced. And finally, why is this actually important? Because if you go back to the surface tension law, which is called Lipplas law, this is really important. You have to know this, which is 2 surface tension over the radius. We said, okay, surface tension is creating the pressure against you filling up the air, but we need to calculate it at the end. There's no point of actually just knowing that it exists without calculating it. We need to calculate it, and it's actually proportional to surface tension and inversely proportional to the radius. So memorize this law as well. And here this is exactly telling you again that this is the relatively same thing about the relative size of the alveoli are constant because of the surfactants. So again, they're solving 2 main problems, 2 not 4, 2 problems. The first is the collapsible nature of the alveoli, and the second is the relative. So it's keeping the relative size of the alveoli the same. See, like this, so you have better ventilation and perfusion. You'll take that later on, but remember, Hella, and you have to know that they have to be the same size, or it's better if they are approximately the same size with the same volume. So now we're into this that. This is basically خلاص, we're done with mechanics. This is more of the filling up mechanics. Uh, it's a summary. So if we go back, we will go through this with the lecture. So if you go through this, this is the first point. First point, you are the alveolar pressure. See here, it's 0 because the barometric pressure is 0. So you're not expiring, you're not inspiring. This is you just idly, just sitting in your place idly. You're not doing anything. So how do you attract the air inwards? Remember from the volumes, we said that the pressure, there needs to be a pressure change for things to expand and contract. So the same is this, the thing goes the same for the vice versa. So if you increase the volume, the pressure decreases. So if you increase the volume here, so what we do is basically we increase the volume. When we increase the volume, like in here, the pressure decreases. And so this is during inspiration. In the pressure decreases, there is a pressure gradient from outside, the 0, to the pressure gradient inside. So what happens is you're basically filling up the alveoli with the air from the outside pressure from the atmosphere. So again, we said here this is 0, this is the normal. We said that if there is a pressure difference, there is movement of air. Movement of air is always related to pressure difference. So you have to know the pressure difference to know the movement of the air. So how do you tell this here? We tell this here part by giving here that this is zero. So how do we create the pressure difference? We create it by increasing the volume. So increase the volume, you have a pressure difference or a pressure gradient. The air flows from the pressure gradient from the higher atmospheric pressure to the lower atmosphere to the lower pressure, and so you're filling up the volume, filling up the lungs with new air. And after that, خلاص, you're done doing that. The lung itself, once you relax the muscles, we're not gonna say it's compressing it or like it's collapsing because it has a collapsive nature because of the compliance, because of its compliance with the chest wall. So the lung itself wants to go back to its original state. So once you relax your respiratory muscles, your inspiratory muscles, the lung will itself go back to its normal place because of all of the compliance factors we talked about. So it will go back to its normal place and expire the air outwards. Here, this is the pleural pressure is always the same as well. You're trying to expand the volume of the lungs. How do you expand the volume of the lungs? It's not just the muscles pushing out, they're pushing out the chest wall as well. So you're decreasing the pressure as well. And here is the same as well. Once you fill the lung, it has more volume, has more air, the pressure decreases even more. And then once you finally, خلاص, you're done ventilating, the oxygen exchange and the carbon dioxide exchange is over, you're getting back to the normal level or trying to get the lungs back to the normal state, then the pleural pressure will go up again as well as the lung. And here again, to see, we're trying to get back. Once the lung is collapsing again on itself, it's increasing the pressure inside, increasing the air pressure. So the air is flowing outwards again. So you have to remember, airflow is related to pressure. If you want to manipulate the pressure, you manipulate the volume. And this is exactly what happens in here. This is the overall conclusion. And this ties in very nicely with the slides, with the rest of the lecture. But these are very important, very important. Dr. Shams loves curves, basically. But what happens in here is, again, this is everything we talked about so far, and some rudimentary lung mechanics from before in the previous lectures, in the introductions. Can I just, sorry. All right, if you get this back here, you'll find that you have the volume over here. The volume, imagine it with me. You have, this is the FRC. We said FRC is what? It's the residual volume and the expiratory reserve volume. This is the FRC. The capacities are two volumes mushed together into one quantity. Call it here FRC. So what happens here? You're from FRC, your normal state, just up like up there in the graph over here. You're at normal state. You're at FRC. So what happens here? The volume as you're inspiring is increases. This is the easiest curve of them all. The volume is increasing. You're increasing the volume. What happens after that? خلاص, you're done ventilating. Ventilation means the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You're done exchanging carbon and oxygen and everything. What do? You're tracting the volume again, and so the lung volume or the respiratory system's volume overall goes back down to FRC. Curve very self-explanatory, Salaha. Here is the expiratory flow. Expiratory flow, you have to remember here, the negative means inwards, positive, outwards. You have to memorize this. Is in, is out. I don't know if you can hear that. Let's see any. That would be awkward. Okay, so the negative is inwards, the positive is outward. So what's happening here? If it's going in, you're trying to increase this. You're trying to increase the volume. So what happens? You're expanding the volume by your muscles. The muscles expand. The pressure here is dropped. You have to think of it like this. It's a very nice story. So the muscles expand. The pressure drops. When the pressure drops, what happens? The air from outside comes in. So it's flowing inwards. So inwards is a negative sign. So it's flowing inwards. So it's going, the expiratory flow is flowing down until it flowed as much as possible. This is done overall here. The peak expiratory flow happens midway in the inspiration, because here you have no expiration, no nothing. خلاص, you're done with inspiring. So here, the expiratory flow is peak in the mid inspiration, and at between the inspiration and expiration, you have no flow, so it's back to zero. So remember it like this: your expiratory flow. How do you draw this curve? Or if he asks about this curve, expiratory flow, you're expiring, you're inspiring, you're flowing inwards. So the peak of it will happen in the middle of the inspiration. And when you're not inspiring, you're not expiring, there's no flow. So this is the zero. Expiration, exact opposite. Khalas, you're done. You have air is full in your lungs. There's high pressure in there. The volume is great. You're trying to collapse it again, or the lungs are collapsing again because of what? Remember, because of the compliance of the lung and the stretchiness of the lung. So it's getting back out. So what happens? Air is flowing out of your mouth, just like this. So it's flowing out. So we have a positive expiratory flow. Here, exact same idea. It's like this is literally the curve from this slide, from the back slide. The alveolar pressure is normal, zero. It's decreasing in inspiration, increasing, and then normal at end of inspiration. Khalas, you're done. You're inspiring, and now you're expiring. You're not flowing anything. There is no flow. There is no pressure. So this is why it's important to remember. There's air pressure is tied. Airflow is tied to pressure. So if there is no airflow, there is no air pressure. Sorry, there's sorry. The airflow is this. Yeah, there is no pressure. So the alveolar pressure is back to zero over here. Again, so it's basically the same curve as the expiratory flow, but because of the pressure. So again, airflow, the really important concept. Flow is tied to pressure. This is really important in ventilation later on. Flow is tied to pressure. So if you have pressure curve is the same as expiratory flow curve. And finally, pleural pressure, it drops up to the midpoint of inspiration because as you're inspiring, you're increasing the volume. The volume increase would lead to what? Would lead to the volume increase would lead to what? It would lead to you dropping in the pressure, because we said volume and pressure are also related. So the volume increase, the pressure decrease. What would happen up to this point? And then the air will flow in again. You're dropping even more pressure. So it becomes the least at the point between the inspiration and expiration. And then again, the opposite happens for the expiration. So you have to think of it as a story. Everything ties in very nicely. It's basically compliance and air pressure flowing in and out, and compliance bringing everything back up. And just memorize the curves, or understand and memorize. If you understand the curves, you memorize them, and you should be good to go with these lectures with the lung volumes and these as well. Okay, I kind of screwed up this. Do you guys know what's the answer to this? Which of the following remains after maximal expiration? This is lung volume. We talked about, we not just talked about, we talked about that before. You guys know? FRC, no. I mean, yeah. Okay, so it's residual volume. Why is it residual volume? We said the curve for the ventilation goes like this. Wait a second. Yes, here it is. So the curve for ventilation is like this. You maximally expired. This is the tidal volume. You maximally expired. Remember, expiration is downwards. Expiration is always negative in this world, literally. So expiration, if you're ventilating, it's going down. If you're what's it called? What's the other one? If you're if the expiratory flow chart, it's always also down. It's also down or negative. So it's always down or down like this or negative like this. So maximal expiration is going down to what? To the least physiological space of the lungs that's left, which is the RV. And then over here, if we go back to the question, why not, for example, why not FRC? Because FRC is ERV, it's both the ERV and the RV. So this is the end of normal exhalation. FRC would be the correct answer. If you're at the end of normal exhalation or expiration, inspiratory reserve volume on its own doesn't really mean much, because it's a difference between the vital and the TLC. It's not really an answer. It's this difference, and the expiratory reserve volume is also this answer. So it doesn't really make any difference, unless like you thought, okay, you have like after the maximum expiration, what's the volume expired? Then it's the ERV. If he tells you, if you're, for example, you're a normal student who just finished his test, he's done sitting in his place, and he suddenly was shocked, he hyper exhaled. what happens or what's the amount of volume that's lost? It's the expiratory reserve volume in that case, because he expired excessively. So here the answer is B. Okay, I recommend that again. Which of the following volumes in the running remain after normal expiration? Again, we kind of talked about that. It's a FRC. I didn't remember that was a question. Okay. So what's after these? Which of the following shows correct sequence and structure in oxygen molecule has to pass to bond with hemoglobin? So this is not really like covered. I guess I kind of wanted to leave it here. When I put the question, I was like, okay, this is a good question to leave it here because this is not really showed well in the lecture, I suppose. But generally speaking, the lecture would have to go through. Sorry. Uh, okay, for for the second question, are you talking for the? Sorry, am I doing? Oh, all right, sorry. Are you talking about the second question or the first question? B. All right, yeah. First question. First question is B. Okay. Here, sorry if I can't. Okay, so here, the overall what happens is surfactants are on the outside, endothelium is on the inside. Or sorry, if خليني bring out the picture better. Yeah, the answer is A because it's surfactant on the outside. Why are we doing this? Where is the yes here? Let's delete this. If you go back here, you'll find that the water is outside here. These are the cells. It's basically like the normal structure of the cell. You have the cells normally just vibing on the vibing on themselves هيك عادي. So these are the cells. Up top of them, or on top of them, there is this water layer. This water layer that's actually pushing in the alveolus and trying to collapse it. So when you put the surfactant, it's not going to be right outside of the epithelium. You want it to affect the surface tension of the molecules inside of the epithelium, inside of the alveolus, and not outside. You're not pushing it between the epithelia and something outside. You're pushing it here between and in the water that's between the oxygen here and the epithelia here. And this is why water was easier to fill because when you're filling it in here, خلاص, there's no phase difference. You don't need surfactants. But because you have air, you need a medium or something to cover between the air that's inside of the alveolus and the watery contents of the alveolus. Because again, the water is partly mucus, partly secreted, but also because we are made of water. We're 70% water. So this is there naturally in cells. Has to come across the brain to good stuff like that. Yeah, it's from the cell. It's getting produced from the cell, which is the epithelia type 2 here. So say, for example, this is the cell. It's produced and pushed outwards. It's not being secreted behind it or in it. It's being pushed here into the fluid or the side between the air and the water. This is, if you remember it, like, okay, like surfactants, they are bridging the gap between the different phases, the air and the water. So that's why we have it in the superficial layer that's between the epithelia, the water, and the what's it called and the air that's inside of the alveolus. So it has to pass first through the surfactant and then to the epithelium. You get me? Yeah. All right. So, all right. Perfect. Thanks. All right. So we and we're done for the day. Yeah. For example, here endothelium, you're making it in the endothelium and then you're pushing it out, but not into but it's outside. It's pushed to the outside between the air and the epithelium itself. It's not in the epithelia or between the endothelium and the capillary endothelium. And same exactly here. Uh, Thank you very much, guys. If you have any questions, please reach out. I suppose I should have added here a slide. Thank you. Thank you very much, guys, for attending and watching. If you need anything, you can always reach out. This is my like Zeyad Farahat 054-239-0095. This is my phone number. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Don't worry about it. We're always here to help. Thank you guys very much.